Alright, stop right where you're at. We're gonna go to matches.
Man, I really do want this to happen in a New Era season of Survivor. It would be the funniest thing I've ever seen. Do you think Maria would see the fire in Becky's eyes for taking out Sandra here? With the finale of Survivor 48 upon us, we will soon be faced with another exhilarating instance of people hitting knives against flint to secure their spot at the final tribal council, really representing that strategic and social subtlety that Survivor's all about. In honor of this tradition that's universally agreed to be a good change which everyone is happy about, today we'll be taking a look at just how impactful forced firemaking has been on Survivor. Man, I was 18 when they introduced forced Final Four firemaking, and last week I became a doctor in computer science. What on earth, time really does stop for no one. Let's get into it. We'll start with the obvious question. What seasons did forced firemaking change the result of? Weirdly enough, fewer than you'd think. Obviously there's Survivor heroes versus healers versus hustlers. Without firemaking, Ben is voted out, and I know you don't want to hear it, but I've always held true to the idea that Ryan wins the season in that case. You can fight me in the comments. You can also subscribe while you're down there. Thank you very much. Ghost Island is a season where you may think firemaking made a difference. After all, if it were a normal vote, why not just vote out Wendell here? But with Laurel's master plan of sit next to the two biggest players of the season and hope that they split the votes and you end up winning via a plurality vote. It's entirely plausible she saves Wendell in the standard vote anyway. We end up with the exact same result. I don't know why Laurel's strategy never really caught on. I'm sure it will work one day. David vs Goliath is another season where I don't think it matters. Nick won immunity and he was beating any of the final four at Final Tribal Council. Maybe there's a timeline where Mike White ends up in fire against Kara as a result of betrayal instead of as a necessity, which in turn causes them to want to fight for a spot in the game at the end. I'm reaching here. So far we are 1 for 3, and it was the one season where no one knew firemaking was going to happen. Edge of Extinction, a season defined by its Final Four firemaking maneuver. It wouldn't have made a difference if it wasn't there. Devin still goes home. Maybe Gavin gets a few extra jury votes, but this jury was cooked from the start. I know, let's make it so the jury has spent a ton of time with one finalist trauma bonding and basically no time with another. Jeff Probst, you've done it again. Island of the Idols, we still have no change, they vote out Lauren, we end up with the same result. Maybe the jury respects Dean marginally less for not taking it out in fire, but I doubt it. Alright, it only took 5 seasons, but we finally got a second instance of Final Four firemaking having a direct impact on who sits at Final Tribal Council and who wins. In Winners at War, it's safe to say Michelle and Natalie vote for Tony. It's safe to say Tony votes for Michelle, but what does Sarah do? If she votes for Michelle, we probably end up in a final 3 of Sarah, Tony, Natalie, where Tony probably wins. Otherwise it's a final 3 of Sarah, Michelle, Natalie, and Sarah probably wins? Maybe Natalie does? Maybe Michelle does. I'm very unsure. I think Sarah and Natalie were both pretty disliked by a chunk of the jury, but would they really vote for Michelle? This is what firemaking robs us of sometimes. But for those keeping track, that's 2 out of 6 results changing because of forced firemaking. On to the new era. Survivor 41, I'm pretty sure Deshawn gets voted out here, which means we finally get the Heather cut, let's go. I don't think she wins the season, Erica still takes it, and firemaking doesn't change the winner, but Heather might get runner-up. Surely there's no way Survivor could give her a terrible edit when she's the runner-up, right? We're getting the Heather Hans edit in this timeline. Survivor 42 is more interesting than I expected. I initially thought Mike would go home 3-1 and nothing would change, but it seems as if that's not the case. Jonathan and Mike very likely stick together and vote Marianne, which in turn means that Marianne likely goes home in firemaking against Mike. If that happens, we're in for a weird final tribal council, where Mike is the frontrunner, who sucks at explaining his game, but does anyone really want to vote for Jonathan or Romeo? We're now 3 for 8, for anyone keeping score at home. Survivor 43, it actually doesn't matter, they vote out Jesse and we're good to go. You may argue that Gabler no longer has the credit for taking out Jesse, but I think the jury just really wanted an excuse to not vote for Cassidy. I'm also aware that a few people think Gabler gives Jesse fire here in a 2-2 vote split against Owen. I couldn't find anything to back this up, but based on Jesse's fire performance, I doubt it matters. Survivor 44 also likely doesn't change. Maybe Carson can convince Carolyn or Jam Jam to give him fire, but it feels very unlikely to me, and he still needs to make the fire for that to happen. If he does that, it does change the outcome of the season, but I don't see it. Survivor 45 is an odd one. I assume Katura and Jake vote for Austin, with Dee and Austin voting together to get out Katura, but Dee could easily flip on Austin. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if she did, she was an absolute menace out there. And also, I'm not entirely sure Katura and Jake could work together if their lives depended on it, but regardless of what happens, it won't change who won the season. Survivor 46 sends Ben into a panic attack, I'm sure. Liz has said that she would definitely have gotten votes from Kenzie and Ben. Does Charlie just go along with it, confident he can beat Kenzie? Does he try to vote Kenzie out and convince Ben to flip? It would be very hard for him to convince Ben, I think, especially when Liz was right there to vote out. I would say this means no change would occur, but as we all know, the only reason Maria voted for Kenzie was the fire in her eyes that she saw during the fire-making challenge. This means that, without forced fire-making, we definitely get Charlie winning the season over Kenzie. The alternative would mean Maria is a liar, and I refuse to acknowledge that. So fire-making didn't change who would end up in Final Tribal Council, but it did change the winner of the season. And last for now, Survivor 47, it makes no difference, Rachel beats them all. Alright, so from the 13 seasons in which we've had Final 4 firemaking, I'm willing to confidently say we would have 4 different winners and a few more different Final Tribal Council arrangements if it had never been introduced. That's about a third, which is smaller than I expected, and I can't see Survivor 48 making a strong case for or against firemaking with its results. But this entire analysis is extremely disingenuous because Final 4 firemaking doesn't just impact the Final 4. That would be like saying hidden immunity idols only impact tribal councils where they're played. The concept of them is ever looming, always hanging over the castaways' heads, always on their mind, always informing every single decision they make on their way to that Final 4 tribal council. As a result of Final 4 firemaking, Survivor is simply a different game. Before the introduction of firemaking, you always had one round without advantages, one round where all you could do was win immunity or have positioned yourself correctly to make it to the end. Devins knew he didn't need to worry that much about getting people on board with him or his plans. What he had to do was play enough idols and win enough immunities to make it to the Final 4, and then boom, he has at least a shot at winning fire. Island of the Idols, they knew they had to get Janet out when they did. She was good at making fire. If she made it to the Final 4 firemaking, they had no way to ensure she wasn't making it to the Final Tribal Council. Meanwhile, Janet knew that because she had an idol at 5, she was guaranteed that firemaking challenge. She basically had the game on lock. There was nothing anyone could do to stop her. What do you mean he won a coin flip that gave him an idol nullifier? Since when do coin flips give you advantages on Survivor? What's next, rolling dice to be immune? The concept of forced firemaking is everywhere, it even hangs over camp life. Mary sort of comments on it in the premiere.
I'm glad that everyone saw me make the fire. However, I feel like in the new era, people also don't give a about that.
No one cares if you're a good firemaker who can keep them warm. What they really care about is if you're a good firemaker who can ruin their chances of winning the $1 million at the end. This whole firemaking twist really does shock me because we've played these games before. We know what happens when you introduce a twist that makes it easier for bigger players to make it to Final Tribal Council. We have the Final 3, which production introduced because the biggest threat was always being taken out in third. If you make a season of Final 3, then everything is fixed, because the person who came third now has a chance to plead their case to the jury. But the players are smart. They adapt. In fact, Survivor goes out of their way to cast people that are fans of the show. When the Final 3 became commonplace, people just started voting out the biggest threat in 4th place. And production tried to adapt to this by adding firemaking. But did they not expect anyone else to adapt? Now the players are sent home the biggest threat at 5 instead. It's not a coincidence. Genevieve, Maria, Ricard, Janet, Lauren, Allison, why are 5 out of 6 of those women? That's a conversation for a whole other time. And that's why, even though the act of Final 4 firemaking may not actually decide who wins most seasons compared to a traditional vote, it does impact who wins every single season because it's an entirely different season as a result of this twist always existing. I'm hoping that in Survivor 50 we don't end up with firemaking, but what would be even funnier is if that happens and we end up with firemaking anyway because there's a deadlock tie. That would be so funny to me. I want that to happen now. But what do you think? Do you think forced firemaking was a bad change? Was it a good change? Let me know. Until next time, I've been Henry Hickman, Survivor, and I'll see you at the finale.